Charles Darwin is well known as the father of evolution. He made great contributions to evolutionary biology, being the first to develop the theory of evolution by natural selection. However, his legacy extends far beyond the simple biology theory. The development of the theory of evolution by natural selection was a turning point in history, as it greatly changed people's perspective on the world in many areas. It paved the way to breaking free of blind faith. While the concept of evolution had been suggested before, the theory of evolution by natural selection provided the explanation which would truly convince people, being a scientific theory based on real observations. It explained changes and adaptations in creatures over time. People were also misled into believing that the main principles of the theory of natural selection were applicable to human society, resulting in the establishment of a pseudoscience used to justify mistreatment and murder. In the early 20th century, some state legislators were passed in the US outlawing the teaching of evolution in biology classes for the sole reason that it contradicted the biblical creation story. Before, most people agreed that God had created every different species for their intended purpose, never to change. However, the introduction of the theory of evolution by natural selection started a debate which would last several decades. It also led to breakthroughs in evolutionary biology and genetics, but what was once a scientific theory was turned into reasoning for discrimination, imperialization, and mass extermination. While Darwin was developing his theories long after the Age of Enlightenment supposedly ended, it still influenced thinkers like Darwin to put out their own ideas. During the Age of Enlightenment, many scientists and philosophers like Locke, Newton, and Voltaire were developing their greatest ideas which would forever impact history. The Age of Enlightenment specifically encouraged people to put reason over religion. If it weren't for the Age of Enlightenment, it is possible that Darwin would never have shared his findings with the public. In 1830, the 22-year-old Charles Darwin went on a 5-year expedition which was named in the Naturalist. The survey ship was the HMS Beagle, and the main objective was to make naval charts of South America. During the voyage, Darwin surveyed 10 of the Galapagos Islands, and he noticed that the birds were all similar but with great variations in their beaks, namely their shape, size, and function. Half the species appear nowhere else on Earth. While the Bible stated that God had created every species individually, Darwin wondered if instead the changes could be explained by the large scale of geological time and how many small changes from generation to generation would build up. Because the birds were all similar, Darwin concluded that they originated from one original bird species, which over time evolved and gained different traits. He also looked at the food for the birds available on the island, and noticed that the islands with larger, harder seeds mostly had birds with thicker beaks, and the islands with smaller, softer seeds had more birds with smaller beaks. From this, he concluded that the generation with less favorable traits died or did not have the chance to reproduce, leaving the ones that had more favorable traits to reproduce and pass on their traits. With all this in mind, Darwin debated with the captain of the ship, Captain Fitzroy. Captain Fitzroy happened to have firm religious beliefs, acting as a useful trigger for Darwin to continue putting thought into this theory. He drafted a sketch of his theory in 1842, but Darwin had no intention of publishing his theory, as he feared being laughed at and even being attacked by devoted religious members. He would continue ironing out the fine details of his theory, experimenting with different species. He started writing his final product in 1856, which would become On the Origin of Species. When Charles Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species, it immediately sparked debate. The book was incredibly controversial because it contradicted the biblical account of creation, opposing those faithful. 1 year after Darwin's book was published, the Oxford evolution debate took place in 1860, with Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, arguing against Thomas Huxley, an associate of Darwin's, in front of a crowd of more than 500 people. It is said that Wilberforce made fun of Huxley's possible ape descent, which Huxley supposedly responded to by stating, "If then the question is put to me whether I would rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather, or a man highly endowed by nature and possessed of great means of influence, and yet employs these faculties and that influence for the purpose of introducing ridicule into a grave scientific discussion, I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape." There have also been attempts, and successful ones, to remove the teaching of the theory of evolution from biology classes. One high school teacher, John Thomas Scopes, was convicted of illegally teaching the theory of evolution, which was known as the Monkey Trial of 1925. His teaching was in violation of a Tennessee state law which made it a misdemeanor to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. While Scopes lost the trial, the verdict was overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court 2 years later on a technicality, which would then be reinforced by the Supreme Court in 1968 as a violation of the First Amendment. Eventually, more people would come to accept Darwin's theory. Many other people were inspired by Darwin's theory and decided to build off on it. Darwin's theory caused changes far greater than a scientific theory normally would have that are still remembered today. Gregor Mendel, an Austrian botanist and monk, was one such person who not only contributed to Darwin's theory, but made observations himself which would lead to a breakthrough in genetics. While Darwin did observe that traits were passed down from parent to offspring, he never figured out the exact process of how they were. Mendel, through thousands of experiments with pea plants, drew three main conclusions relating to how certain characteristics passed from generation to generation, with these conclusions now known as Mendel's laws of inheritance. In 1865, Mendel presented his results in two separate lectures, publishing his paper Experiments on Plant Hybrids, which documented his results the next year. However, Mendel would believe his observations to be trivial, and he made no effort to publicize his paper, so his work was mostly ignored by other scientists as they believed that what he observed only applied to certain categories of species. After Mendel would come William Bateson, who discovered Mendel's work around 30 years after it was published. He would find that the results of his experimental breeding tests were explained perfectly by Mendel's work. He then shared Mendel's work, translating his papers and spreading it across Europe. While Darwinism started out as a theory specifically about evolution, its main ideas were thought to be applicable to human society. The term survival of the fittest was one of the main takeaways from Darwin's theory, specifically how the strongest would survive and pass on their positive traits for the overall benefit of the species. People mistakenly applied these rules to human society and would start to believe that those who were in power were so due to them being more fit and possessing more desirable traits. One strong proponent of this viewpoint was Francis Galton, a cousin of Darwin who was one of the first to recognize the implications of Darwinism on human society, developing the idea of selective mating among humans for the betterment of the species, as well as discouraging overbreeding of the lower class. This, in theory, would increase the proportion of people with more desirable genetics. The members of the higher class mainly supported the idea that they were ruling as a result of them being more fit. Galton would later name the concept of selective breeding and reproduction as eugenics. Unfortunately, these ideas would come to the attention of Adolf Hitler. After a failed coup attempt in 1924, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, Adolf Hitler was imprisoned. During this time, he started reading about eugenics and social Darwinism, adopting this take on society. He believed that Germany had grown weak as a result of the non-Aryan race being in power, and for Germany to thrive again, the Aryan race had to be dominant, and the gene pool had to be pure. Once Hitler was released from prison, the Nazi Party would target groups they considered inferior and in need of extermination, like Jews, homosexuals, and people with disabilities. This event is remembered today as the Holocaust, and now serves as a warning to all of us about discrimination and a reminder of the importance of human rights. The development of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was a turning point in history. Initially held in derision, it made people who blindly followed religion open their eyes. In addition, what was once a strictly scientific theory branched off into a pseudoscience, which was used to justify dehumanization and mistreatment. Following its sharing with the public, it was incredibly controversial for decades, but is now a widely accepted theory which is referenced by many. Darwin's impact is undeniable, and it affected our perception of the world vastly.